Okay, welcome everyone to this really interesting session on mapping initiatives, looking at focusing on development interventions in low and middle income countries. As many of you would know, evidence in mapping initiatives important synthesis sort of tool makes evidence available and accessible on any policy relevant question or research question. Although mapping has existed for many years, the interactive version of the map has come in the last 10 years or so. And organizations like Campbell and 3IE have done a lot to make advances in this area. And so today, what we have is a very interesting session that looks mapping in 3 different ways. What is so interesting about mapping is that it has made evidence available, discoverable, and it has something for everyone. It has something for researchers, something for policymakers, something for funders, because it shows the evidence and it also shows. So today's speakers are Saran, Ashwani, Verma. All 3 are from Campbell, South Asia. I just started about them before they speak. Them has 15 minutes to present, and we'll reserve 15 minutes for questions and answers. If you do have questions, do put those in the chat function, the Q&A function. We'll pick those up at the end of the presentation. So I'm going to ask Ashrita to start off. Ashrita is a familiar face, I'm sure. Doesn't quite need an introduction. She's the director of Campbell South Asia. She's a dedicated team that works on producing and using evidence, different kinds, systematic reviews, evidence. Over the last years, I've seen Ashrita do so much for the development of evidence in maps. A lot in the area. There's a lot of learning from it. So Ashrita, do you want to go ahead? Make it.
Thank you so much, Radhika, for that warm introduction. And I hope my screen is visible to everyone now. So good morning, good afternoon, and hello, everyone. So in this panel, we would be talking a bit about the different mapping initiatives done by Campbell's team over the years. And we have a similar panel called Panel 18.1. We will be talking a little bit more about some of the initiatives on evidence mapping, as well as a little bit about what Campbell South Asia has been doing. So please do join in that session as well. And in this session, I would be talking a little bit about giving examples from 2 evidence and gap maps that I led about equity, identifying equity gaps, and some equity consideration that we can have while we are designing the evidence and gap maps framework. And my colleagues here, they would also be talking a little bit about innovations and an example of evidence and gap maps. So before I get on with directly to the equity, the whole purpose of doing evidence and gap map is the use of it. So what you see here on the screen is a strategic approach to building evidence architecture, which is from a paper by Howard White. It is already published. What you see on the top level, the top 3 level of the pyramid is basically are the evidence-based decision-making products. But to get to the top 3 level of the pyramid, you definitely need a strong base. And what evidence and gap map does is they provide a linking area between the top and the bottom of the pyramid. So you really cannot have a stronger top unless you have a stronger foundation. So evidence and gap map not only helps us tell the distribution of evidence across the different interventions and outcome categories, but it also helps us assess the distribution of evidence across the various population subgroups, various income regions, and various other country-related filters and secondary dimensions. And this is where exactly the equity part of the equity component of the evidence and gap maps gets in. And the 2 examples that I will tell you today is going to show you that based on these examples and based on the findings of these 2 maps, there are considerable equity gaps that remains in many sectors of these evidence mapping. So evidence and gap maps, they are basically a matrix of interventions and outcomes, as you can see on the screen, and they form the primary dimensions of the map. The bubbles that you see on the maps, they are basically corresponds to the type and the quality of the evidence. And like I mentioned, evidence and gap map, they are meant to show the areas of evidence concentration, which are highlighted in green here, and meant to show the areas of evidence gap highlighted in red. But apart from the primary dimensions of the map, evidence and gap map, they also have something called as secondary dimensions, which are formed by the study design, your region, country, and of course the population subgroups. And equity can play its picture in both of these dimensions. So for example, when we are defining the evidence and gap map framework, we can have equity incorporated into that framework in the form of specific interventions that we want to include as a part of inclusion criteria. One example that I can give you is, for example, as per the statistics by UNCEF study, if we see children with disabilities, they are 5 to 10 times more likely to be excluded from the school than children who are without disability. Now, if you want to include a study, and if you talk about the determinants of this statistics, it is seen that it is due to the stigma arising due to disability in those areas. And this stigma can be not just outside, but inside the home and by religious leaders. So one similar kind of intervention studies that I would like to include in my framework would be, for example, behavioral management for parents of children with disabilities, or behavioral management for religious leaders of children with disabilities. So this is something that you can incorporate into your interventions. Similarly, when we are defining our outcomes, we can have equity-related outcomes incorporated into our framework. For example, school exclusion, stigma, social identity. In a similar manner, when we are defining our secondary dimensions, let's talk about study design for a matter. And I'll give you an example from people with disability. Comparison kind of studies, they are usually the most useful when we are trying to assess the intervention. But if you talk about people with disabilities, if a single subject study design, they're equally important. Because I think most of the rehabilitation practice research, they are based around single subject design for a variety of reasons. Cost is one of them, of course. And there are other factors because of which most of the rehabilitation practice designs that you will see, the research would be around single subject design. So if I want to include and make my evidence and gap map more equity focused, I would like to include those study design as well. Similarly, let's talk about population subgroups. So I'll give you an example when we talk about people with disability evidence and gap maps, but there are different population subgroups that are highly vulnerable. It could include women, it could include people coming from low-income groups or humanitarian settings. So equity considerations and evidence mapping is usually considered in two main ways, where evidence and gap map, they map studies or effect either with an explicit equity focus on a specific dimension of an equity, for example, disadvantaged population. An example can be interventions for people with disabilities and LMICs. And another aspect would be where evidence and gap map studies affect not explicitly aimed at reducing inequity, but present data which are disaggregated by gender, disability, age, and income settings. There are several examples for such evidence and gap map from both Campbell and 3i. An example my colleague would be presenting today would be evidence and gap map on transport interventions. And of course, one example is mega map on child well-being. So let's dive into disability evidence and gap map. So disability evidence and gap map, the framework was based on World Health Organization community-based disabilitation matrix, which mainly comprised of 5 components related to health, education, livelihood, social outcomes, and empowerment-related interventions and outcomes. We updated this map and we tend to include 110 reviews and 164 impact evaluation. Now, talking about how we incorporated equity into the framework, definitely we took the interventions and outcome designs from the community-based rehabilitation matrix, but the subcategories had equity components in the form of accessibility, in the form of access to services. So those components were incorporated. Similarly, when we talked about population, of course, this was based on population people with disabilities, but there are several population subgroups under this that are even more vulnerable, either because they do not have those access to those services, or because they might have high prevalence of disability in those population subgroups. So when we included them and analyzed them, what we did identify was that there were clear gaps in number of studies on these population subgroups, such as people who are belonging to ethnic minorities, or people who are migrants or from refugee settings or street connected children. We had very few evidence coming from this sector. But this is not the only thing that these equity focused map can let you know. What it also helps us identify is where exactly is the equity issue and where exactly is the most effective intervention studies for that particular issue. I'm just giving few examples. There's several in those in the different maps that we have. Let's take an example from children, because we know that children with disabilities, they are more vulnerable, because there are numerous reports that does document that children with disabilities are among the poorest members of the population and are one of the most marginalized and excluded groups in the society. So if you look at the included studies in the map, we had one of the studies that talked about pre-graduation transition services for persons with autism spectrum disorders, and it shows its effect on employment outcomes. We had similar pictures coming from the equity aspects related to women. So we know that the global literacy rate is as low as 1% for women with disabilities, according to a UNDP study. So we had several studies that talked about education for women. I cannot say several, but of course there were quite few studies related to that population. One example would be the effect of auditory perception training on reading performance of 8 to 9 years old female students with dyslexia. So this is one example how equity issues and identifying intervention studies which are most effective. And here noting down that we can also identify the confidence in the study findings, understanding where exactly are the high confidence studies in those areas. Taking another example from Mega Map on Child Wellbeing, this particular map was actually a very broad map that only included systematic reviews and evidence and gap maps. We updated this map since 2018, and 2021 update just got completed. And this map showed around 536 studies on systematic reviews with 25 evidence and gap maps. Now, if we talk about the equity again, in the framework itself, we had number of equity-related outcomes and equity-related interventions talking about those aspects. And of course, we had several population subgroups included that were more marginalized and were vulnerable in terms of getting interventions or getting services. So if we look at the figures and we compare the trends from when we first ran the search and when we updated in 2021, you can see that there has been some increase in these population subgroups. So overall increase since 2019, if we see, is highest in the adolescent population, which is 60%. But if you look at the proportionate increase targeting children with disabilities, it has been 66%. Of course, the overall number is quite low in this area, but you have to see that there have been an increasing trend even in these areas as well. And again, looking back at identifying the equity issues and where exactly are the key intervention studies in those areas, let's talk about children with disabilities in this particular map. So like I mentioned, there are numerous reports documenting that children with disabilities miss out on schools due to several barriers such as stigma. So we had one systematic review that talked about intervention for reducing stigma experienced by children with disabilities and their families. And it talked about the various interventions surrounding the stigma, both in the community as well as the, at home. So this was the two examples. So let's talk a little bit about the equity consideration and mapping when we are starting with an evidence and gap map. So of course, the stakeholder buy-in is quite important to understand which are the most disadvantaged population for our particular topic or for a particular sector. And of course, when you're setting the inclusion and exclusion criteria, we have to assess the categories that are most disadvantaged for that particular intervention group and also for that particular area. And we need to include the Progress Plus and different ethnicity related incorporation into our PCOs. This is also equally important to develop equity focused search strategy, incorporating search that includes databases, that includes search terms, concepts that are relevant to equity question under considerations. And of course, developing a standardized data extraction tool, not just to code the studies in terms of interventions and outcome, but importantly, their attention to the equity. And when you do that, there are chances that we can actually have, a separate research brief or a separate kind of analysis related to the equity components. We did this for Mega Map, where we had a separate goal area for, every child has equitable chances life. This has been updated regularly. The 2021 update is yet to be released. I'm nearing the end of it. I think I am within my time. So just concluding points on need for equity focused maps. The most important thing is evidence and gap map can help us highlight the absolute gaps and synthesis gap in this particular area. And The main idea is that because it can help in identification of impact evaluation and reviews that present evidence which is disaggregated by priority groups, or they're actually focused on disadvantaged population, like we identified a few studies in people with disabilities evidence in gap map. This can also help inform the design for researchers who are actually going ahead and doing the field research, and importantly, to inform the scope of systematic reviews coming out of it. So one example is we completed the people with disabilities evidence and gap map, and there are 3 ongoing systematic reviews from the disability evidence gap map focused on these key areas, one of which is social inclusion, which is definitely related to equity, and we had other systematic reviews coming on livelihood and education. And of course, having equity, incorporated in the evidence and gap map can support the use of evidence and actually reaching the investment to the most disadvantaged population. One example, again, would be this is currently an ongoing work by CEDL. So they are actually working on developing a disability evidence portals, and the data source for which is basically CEDL's evidence and gap map, which I just showed you previously. So future directions, we definitely need to develop more evidence and more improved evidence and gap map, and ensuring that equity focused and innovation are considered whenever we are starting new evidence and gap map, or we are planning to update any evidence and gap map. We need to work in collaboration to have more equity focused EGMs across all sectors. And of course, working towards Campbell's vision to have a global repository of evidence for discoverability and coordination overall. With that, I'm going to end my presentation. Thank you for listening to me. And if you have any questions, I would be happy to answer them.
Thank you so much, Ashrita. That was great. We often talk about including the equity lens, but this is actually showing how that can be done. This is important work. So we're going to move on to our next presentation. As Ashrita said, please add in questions in the chat or Q&A function, and we'll pick those up. Moving on to Suchi, we'll be sharing findings of an evidence gap map that looks at transport interventions. This is another area that is often not looked at. Great that a map was created just looking at transport. Suchi is an evidence synthesis specialist working at Campbell South Asia. She's worked over 10 years in other organizations, including PIE, but she's joined CSA only very recently, but in such a short span of time, she's done already quite a bit of work on evidence gap maps, thematically, and other policies. Great, Suchi, that you're able to share findings. Go ahead and make a presentation.
Thank you, Chair, for the introduction. I just give me 1 minute. I start presenting. Sure. Just give me 1 more minute. It's like, I think so. It's not showing my presentation.
No worries. No worries. Take your time. Tech can be glitchy, so don't feel pressurized.
Yeah, it's like it's earlier. Just give me. Yeah, it's back. I'm so sorry for just like good afternoon. Yeah, thank you, Radhika. Good afternoon, everyone. I will be presenting the transport evidence and gap map. It's actually a study of the effectiveness of transport sector interventions in low and middle income countries. So I will be talking about what's the background of this EGM, like the objectives, methodology, and the findings of this EGM, transport EGM. First of all, I really want to acknowledge our funder, which is like DFID and also CEDL, Center of Excellence for Development Impact and Learning. And many thanks to all the authors of this EGM. And also, I want to acknowledge the contribution of our information specialist, John Ayer, and AP Reviewer team for support on mapping utility. What are evidence and gap map? It's already covered by, but then just like it's a systematic presentation of all available and relevant evidence for a particular sector or subsector. So like I will be presenting for transport. It's actually tell you display the areas with strong and weak or no evidence. It's a matrix of intervention categories, which is a row, and the outcome domain, which is a column. So if this is one of the mega map example of child well-being, which is like presented. So like intervention categories is row and the outcome domain is columns in EGMs. That's how this interactive map shows. Like, what is this transport evidence and gap app is all about? This EGM provides an overview of the existing evidence of the effects of transport sector interventions related to all means of transport in low and middle income countries. These interventions are classified as infrastructure and maintenance, information and incentives, and institutional framework. In low and middle income countries, the primary outcome, which we actually see in this map, is like transport infrastructures, economic development, health and education, environment, and economic and equity outcomes. So what is the intervention that we actually picked up from the transport? It's actually, we have actually reframed it from Berg et al. Categories. So infrastructure, what we meant by infrastructure in roads, railway, and all the means of transport, roads, railway, ports, or airports. Like if there's any building or maintaining a new transport infrastructure, or like upgrading the existing links and technologies, improving transport services as like public bus services, as like we have a metro services in India. So like some kind of like any improvement in the transport services. Is there any incentives given for road safety and tariffs, like prices or price incentives, includes any subsidies or taxes, and institution, including any regulation like helmet laws that you actually have to have wear helmets. Then outcomes, like transport infrastructure services and use, economic outcomes related to like transport, health and education, culture, environment, and economic and equity analysis. Background of this. So what we actually saying when we actually frame for this map, what we say, like 90% of the world population are transport poor when defined as meeting at least one of the following criteria: lack of available suitable transport, like, or lack of transport to necessary destination. Like transport is available, but there are some destination which is far ahead where there is no transport facilities available. Cost of necessary transport puts household below poverty line, income poverty line. Like a lot of like it's very expensive. And excessive travel time, yet travel conditions unsafe or unhealthy. It's also say that transport investment can transform economics by supporting structural changes, notably the shift of the population from agriculture to manufacturing and services. If there is very good transport, then people actually like would like to travel to city and work. So like it's actually shifting the population from agriculture to manufacturing and services. What we like, the transport is a key component to achieve many sustainable goals. So there are a number of SDGs which is directly linked to transport. So it's not very particular that you have one sustainable goal related to transport, but then there are many which are directly linked to transport. Health, like increased road safety. If you have a good like for health, to have a good health facilities, you should have a good transport. Energy, decent work and economic growth, resilient infrastructure, sustainable cities, sustainable consumption and production, or SDG 14 on ocean, seas, and marine resources. In addition to all this, which I have built, there are also very sustainable transport, which is actually indirectly linked to the transport. Methodology of this. So for this transport EGM, we have a very like inclusion exclusion criteria. So we actually included the impact evaluation and systematic reviews, which talked about the effectiveness of transport sector interventions. In terms of like including the study design, we actually included the experimental designs, non-experimental designs, and regression design with which control for confounding variables, and any other design with the comparison groups. But we excluded before versus after studies with no comparison groups. We also excluded the qualitative research because this is only, EGM is only focusing on the quantitative ones. We have not included any process evaluation and qualitative research in EGM. What's the methodology? It's like it's a PICO of this. Like, so population living in low and middle income countries, intervention like infrastructure development, incentives, and institution outcomes. Like the majorly 6 outcomes which already explained. In the next slide, I will tell like these are the outcome subcategories which we actually. So in transport infrastructure services, and we actually include the infrastructure quantity and quality if included. Like any safety assessment was done. Infrastructure services like good services, and all this has been improved. transport time or cost, like it's taken care, the congestion has taken care, or any other like which has taken care, like limited the transport time. Market access, like if got because of the good transport facilities, the market access has been improved. Transport modality, like car ownership, safe practices. Then in economic impact, we actually look into the household income and poverty improved because of the transport services. Economic development, employment and agriculture, migration, trade and tourism has been increased because of the transport. Location and displacement. So it also has a negative thing, like even though transport infrastructure has been, so there will be like some people who have actually displaced from that place. So like we also looked into that. Health and education, access to health facilities, health outcomes, access to education facilities, education outcomes. In health outcomes, we actually see two positive and negative, like roads, like a lot of road injuries happen because of the low level of transport or poor quality of the transport. And also we looked into the health access has been improved because of the health outcomes. So there were like two things that we have seen into health outcomes. Culture, value, language, and social cohesion, culture, heritage, and cultural diversity. Environment, we look into air quality, noise pollution, habitat distraction. Economic and equity analysis, like we see cost effectiveness, gender equity, and transport equity. The search methodology, we actually search of a relevant systematic review on primary studies from academic databases. Then we also search on the grey literature from the organization searches, international organizations, and search additional website. Then we also search bibliography searches and hand searching of relevant journals for transport EGM. So the first phase was already on the academic database, and the second stage include the grey literature search and hand searching of relevant journals. These were the databases that we have actually included into our map. These were the databases, these were the organization searches. We looked into ADB, we looked into World Bank, IFPRI, IPA3I, and we also looked into the relevant journals. What's the prisma of this map? So we actually identify from the database like 538 records. But then we like for the full text screening, like 458 were full text screen. In the phase one, which I select, this phase one is only the academic databases, and the phase two include the grey literature search. In phase one, we have 312 for included for coding, and the phase two we have 417. From the phase one, we actually included 250 impact evaluation and 22 systematic reviews, 182 impact evaluation, 12 systematic reviews from the second phase. These are the snapshot of the transport EGM. So if you can see, like we have a map. In this map, we have 428 impact evaluation, 34 systematic reviews. So if you see, there were a lot of evidence concentration to roads in different outcomes, and then there were like very less evidence on the port shippings and waterways. So these, like you can actually go into the map and see the secondary dimension of the map, and you can also bubble, like when you click on the bubble, you can actually list of the identified studies and read the user summaries for the studies. These, like I will talk about the findings of this. So these were like plain language summaries. It's in the draft version. It will become online. So this is about the transport EGM. The study design. So we only have included 4% RCTs. Non-experimental with comparison were 27, and then we have a 57% of studies with other regression design, and 7% was systematic reviews. This is a geographical distribution of the studies. So we have a most representation from East Asia and Pacific, like 40% of the studies were from East Asia and Pacific, and we have a very least representation from Europe and Central Asia, Middle East and North Africa. The studies are concentrated to China, like we have 141 studies from China, and then the next one is India with 45 studies, and then other than that, like from Sub-Saharan Africa, 16 from Ethiopia, and then we have less numbers in other countries. Population, like urban, like 56% of the studies that we found is like actually concentrated to urban population, and then like rural was 21%. Intervention categories, as explained. So if you see that most evidence on road infrastructure and intervention categories, and then we have a very less in evidence on civil aviation and port shipping and waterways. Outcomes, if you see the most evidence, like we got 351 studies with transport infrastructure services and use and outcome, and that there were very least evidence in culture outcome, like only 6 studies talked about it. And then economic and equity analysis, also only 9 studies we found on. In regards to evidence concentration gaps and outcome categories, like as explained that like in transport infrastructure services and use, like a lot of studies. So transport time or cost, they're like 193 studies. There were like means of the transport, 160 studies, which talked about that the car ownership has been increased, which also talked about like electric car was like were introduced and people were like, so like, and then second, like economic development, like GDP, agriculture development has been increased. Other than that, like health outcomes, 104 studies. We only got 4 studies with noise pollution. We only got 2 studies on transport equity, and there were only 3 studies on displacement. We also did a quality appraisal of included reviews. So we actually did a 34 reviews quality appraisal by AMSA 2, which is like a systematic tool for doing the quality appraisal of the systematic reviews. So 85% of the systematic review rated as low and 12% rated as medium. We only got one review which is rated as high confidence in all these things. If you can see this, so yes is like we got the evidence on yes, and partial yes, like yellow only, and red. If you see the red line is like there were like a lot of reviews that we found it's not registered, like protocol was not registered, we don't got a source of funding, and then like risk of bias is also not mentioned in meta-analysis. Transport, these like two pictures, like even though if it's like we talked about the transport infrastructure has been increased and we got a lot of evidence on transport infrastructure services and use, but still in transport in sub-Saharan Africa, if you can see the transport is not up to cater to the population. In this is the second picture is about Indian Railway, like still the transport, even though it has been developed infrastructure, but there are some countries, some region which is not very much developed. Result, as I said, it's not developed because we got a lot of studies from East Asia Pacific, 40%, which is like targeting urban population, 56 studies, 78% of the included studies were on infrastructure, access to transportation in relation to cost and time were 54%. Next is the modes of transport. This is a BRT system which is actually talked about on a lot of the evidence we found. Like we actually found 31 studies which talked about the BRT system, the like transport infrastructure and services. Like infrastructure has been removed, and there were like a dedicated lines to buses and like just to cater to congestion, just to remove congestion, and obviously to save the transport travel time. So like as I said, health outcomes we like is the most counted in health and education categories. Economic development was most kind of agriculture production, GDP, income and poverty and employment and migration also talked about in most. Like we only got few studies on air quality. Only 7 studies are talked about environment. There were only 18 studies which talked about gender equity. As I said, like 84% of the systematic review was rated as low, and there's only one which is high in terms of EMSA rating. Where's the evidence gap? So they like we got a lot of evidence gaps in the like, so they were like waterways, incentives, we don't got much on rails and ports and shipping. Institution also we don't get much evidence on rails, trams and monorails and ports and shipping. In outcomes we don't get much evidence on transport equity, culture, very less evidence on noise pollution, very less evidence on displacement, values and language and social coherence, very less. And there were like also lack of studies targeting rural population. Only 21 studies talked about rural population. So I'm just like summarizing what this map. So the evidence base for the impact of transport is actually unevenly distributed and under reviewed. So it's like it's not very much like, even though it's only focusing on roads, so railway and trams and ports and shipping and civil aviation, we don't get much evidence. It's actually highly concentrated on outcome, which is like transport infrastructure, especially roads. It's also considered in specific region, which is East Asian Pacific. And then China is one of the countries we got 141. It's actually focusing on urban population. Sector with great development potential, such as waterways, are under-examined, like reflecting under-investment. More experimental studies. We only got 4% RCTs needed on the effectiveness studies. Available evidence is more focused on infrastructure intervention. And then we actually need more studies to focus on gender and environment-related outcomes. More high quality systematic review needed, as most included in the maps were found to be low quality. That's about me. Thank you very much. Like I will be happy to answer any questions that you have.
Thank you so much. That was really great. And to see that the findings show that there are several glaring gaps in I believe that there's not a lot on outcomes. So limited evidence on gender equity, both of which areas are, there has to be, should be looking at intersections with one. So thank you so much. It's a very interesting presentation. Moving on now to Ashwani. Ashwani is also an evidence specialist at Campbell, South Asia, a public health professional who's worked for several organizations, and notably the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare. Um, he's also someone who's done a fair bit of work on systematic reviews, gap map, meta-analysis, and today he will be sharing with us his own learning experiences, particularly on piloting and co-designing everything gap. So over to you, Ashwani.
Okay, thank you, Chair, for this introduction. So maybe I can share my screen with everyone. So I guess my screen is visible with everyone right now. So I am, going to talk more about my learning experiences and what are the piloting stages and core production stages for, for developing an EGM or a system, or maybe specifically an EGM, because there is a long process how we develop a framework, how we go with the piloting stage, and what all steps we need to be taken care, which have to be taken care while going for the scoping work. So the first thing I would like to talk about, the typologies. So because we have to develop a framework, and that framework has to be, in the coding stage or codable, and that particular framework has to be resonate with all the users or the stakeholders which are very uh, keen to use this EGM. So first stage is about use of existing typology rather than a new typology. So this is a very basic kind of thing. We have to use the typology which is internationally accepted. These typologies are mainly for the interventions which we are using, the outcomes, and we have a different filters for the EGM and the different dimensions of the map, so which we have discussed right now. So it is always better and it is always advisable to use the internationally accepted typology. And now there are chances, like, there are no existing framework or existing typology which is ready available. So what we can do in that sense, so we can do, the research team or maybe the individuals who are involved in the development of the EGM, they may consult the different, or maybe they can consult our donors or the strategy documents of that particular organization or the organization which is of international standard, or maybe they can consult with the different international actors who are directly or indirectly related with the topic on the EGM or the gap map which you are doing on. And these stakeholders may be from, from the policy background, from they can be the practitioners or they can be the researcher per se. So the main idea is using, having a typology which is really existing previously and internationally accepted, and it has to be universal throughout all the donor, all the users of the map. So I can take an example here. So there is an disability EGM which is conducted by the Saran et al. In 2019, where look at the effectiveness of intervention or disability related interventions. So this is a WHO CBR matrix, that is a community based rehabilitation matrix which they have used. And why I have shown here this matrix, because this is the WHO accepted framework or the matrix, and they have a universal definition of the health, education, livelihood, social and empowerment sector. So this is a one example of using an existing typology of use of the existing framework. So next one is the piloting. So piloting, there is a very good principle of the revise, refine, and define. So what is this revise, refine, and define? So we have to, as you can see in the example, I can start with the screening tool. So there are different steps of of conducting an EGM. Like you have the screen the different studies, you have to code that included studies. But how do you do that? How do you screen those studies? So for that purpose we develop the screening tool, we have to develop the coding tool. But what is the procedure we have to follow? Principally we have to follow of developing a screening tool. So that principle is about the revise, refine, and define. So revise is what? So revise, this is a strategy which can be used in the early stage of designing the screening tool. So revise means you have a particular evidence based components, like in the example which you have seen, we have a screening tool based on the PICOs means the population intervention comparison outcomes and study design. So you have to revise the definition as per the convenience, as per the objective of the AGM which you are doing. So this revision has to be at the early stage, so that uh, you can develop or define this screening tool more precisely initial phases in consultation with the donors, or maybe the funders or the commissioners who are available. So I can tell you from my experience, the recently concluded map, which is funded by the YEF, which is about the which is mainly about the youth crime. So what we did, you cannot imagine that we have piloted these frameworks or these screening tool and coding through, for maybe nearly 8 to 9 weeks with the screening with the uh, this screening tool and the coding tool. And we generally practice to screen and code nearly 4 to 5 studies, and that session was there for will last for 90 minutes. So that particular you can say that practice, the exercise which we did is practicing this tool more and more, so that we can refine it for the next stage, or next stage mean in the sense of using that particular tools in our EGM. So next stage is refine. So that's it. That is called what refine is, like the screening of multiple studies throughout the week, so that we cover all the studies, all the components of the we test all the components of this screening tool. And what we practice in that particular map is we included the all studies, not only the easiest study, but all studies where you are not 100% sure whether to include that study or not include that study. So it is always good to refine these screening tool based on all type of studies, and have a better result. So what how it will help to define that broader category of the studies. So it will help in refining those standards, actually, to those standard to be included or to be involved in the EGM. So this is a particular example of the screening tool which I'm sharing. Next one is about the this one you can see as a coding tool as well. Coding tool in the sense of you included that particular study, but same process has to be gone through the coding tool as well. Coding tool in the sense of whatever the picos you define, you have a particular definition of this pico, and even the screening tool as well. So all the definitions have to be written in a separate document called code book in this, which is a part of the co-production process as well. And that coding tool can act as a data collection tool, as many of us are aware, the data extraction tool in terms of primary studies. But in the EGM and the systematic reviews, we always use the coding tool as a data collection tool for these methods. So the next one is about the co-production, piloting, and the code book. So what it is? So how do we define this co-production tool? So this is nothing but the defining the included uh, interventions, defining the uh, population group, defining the comparison or the outcome group. So we have a code book, as I said right now with you. So what that codebook tells us, it gives a proper standard definition of these categories and subcategories, even as the other dimensions, of the map, which we called as the themes, or which we called as the categories and subcategories or the filters. So we do this piloting of we do this continuous piloting of these framework based on these code books, based on this co-production process. So that we include all types of study with broader you can say with broader outcomes, not only the outcomes but broader scope. So these co-production process help in defining the even the scope of the map, because if we start our frame with our framework, which is which is very, which is not tested, which is not piloted, so there is no point of continuing with that particular framework. So that keep that particular scope robust and that particular framework robust, we always go for the co-production process, which includes all the screening exercise. We have a piloting exercise, the piloting based on the screening as well, based on the coding as well, defining all picos in the initial phases, revises the definitions, and more refine the definition based on the study we do for several weeks. So it always it always give us a feeling that we include each and everything while doing this co-production process, even as the piloting process. So these are the particular examples of the code book which I am showing you. So let's say if we have something like called system category, which is nothing but the education, but we have a different subcategories like the behavior, attendance, and safeguarding, and you can see these we have a definitions. So this is nothing but the example of the it is a part of the co-production unit, co-production while doing this EGM. And on the right side, if you see, we have defined the different themes as well, like the unit of delivery. So what is that unit of delivery? Whether it is an individual, small group, then how can we define that particular small groups as well? So we have defined each and everything. We have categorized and subcategorized all the dimensions of the map, which is a part of the co-production during for conducting an EGM. So again, this is the example of the coding framework which I told you. So we have something called the intervention categories. We have a subcategories as well, and these are the different studies these are the author's name and the year of the studies, and based on based on going through the study. So if I say going through the study, is not only the abstract screening, because abstract screening is just a part. The main purpose or the motto of doing this exercise is to go individual study deep and understand what all components are there in that particular study to get to test or to pilot our screening tool as well as the coding tool. So this is a particular exercises and the framework which we use while testing the coding framework for specifically YEF map, Y is a youth endowment fund map. So on the very left side, intervention categories are given. Next is the intervention subcategories, and these are the authors and the study ID, you can say. And we particularly check, you can see the boxes are there. So we check wherever it fills that it fulfills the criteria, and then we discuss these particular study deeply in those meetings which I just now mentioned you, like the 2 weeks or 8 to 9 rounds of screening exercises or the piloting exercises. So same thing we do for the outcome domain as well. So that is the next thing. So the next point is in co-production processes involving the commissioners in co-production process. So what is that? Why it is important? So these are the commissioners or the individuals from the funder side. You can say they have a clear idea in mind how to use this particular map further. Which help in defining the map or defining the next stage. So I can give you the example of our YEF map which we did last. Maybe last year or early in this year. So that particular map is about the intervention which is related to the youth crime or youth involved in the criminal activities. So that particular map is help in developing the YEF toolkit, which is a very good example of using an EGM in decision making on how or the next step. So by involving these commissioners, they give us a clear sense of what about they have a clear sense of using that particular scope, the components of this particular EGM and defining the scope, defining the frameworks. And it is always useful, to include these commissioners even in the piloting phase, so that we can discuss whatever needs to be included in this particular map, so that we can, have the prompt use of this map for further activities. So always, this it is always good to have these commissioners. So these commissioners can be from the policy people, from the, or maybe these can be the practitioners, and as well as the researchers for who has a clear sense about the map or about the scope of the map. So the next co-production part is about, identify the specific categories and intervention in the search strategy. So I can give you the example of this YF only again. So what we developed the search strategy initially. So we got the map, we got everything, it got published. But now the next stage is what? Using a tool of developing a toolkit. So again, we have a search strategy. We have to develop a search strategy, and this time what we did, we know the particular intervention, we know the particular outcome, and we have that these terms in the search strategy again. So what happened in newly developed search strategy for the toolkit is we got more number of studies related to that particular intervention which are not there in the YF map. So there are chances. So what we can do, how can we mitigate that risk? So we always tends to include that particular intervention in the search strategy to get the more number of studies or to cover the broader scope to that particular map. So always this take care about if you are developing a search strategy, make sure you have a particular category of intervention, or maybe the particular intervention per se to get involved in the search strategy. And again, this is not a one-person process. It includes a whole team approach which includes all the researchers, policymakers, practitioners, and even as the donor side individuals or the commissioner who commission the maps. And you can even have international actors who are very much in the field of that particular AGM which you are doing. So I think, yeah, that's all from my side about the co-production process for the map. And I'll be happy to have a questions or more on this particular thing. That's all from my side. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ashwani. That was very helpful, and especially showing us how rigorous an approach this is, and rigorous and systematic, and what you need to be producing a high quality evidence and map.
Exactly.
I don't see any questions so far, so I think everyone should use this option to add in a couple of questions. We don't really have a lot of time. We just have 6 minutes. But if you are able to do add in questions. So while we're waiting, I think I'll use my prerogative as the chair to maybe ask a couple of questions. So I think it's directed to all of you. So if any one of you could answer this. So my first question was on how do you address language barriers in screening studies? I think it was Suchi who perhaps mentioned that you found so many studies from China, right? Like, so how do you address that? Because I think when you're looking at availability of evidence, this can be a crucial factor. I don't know if there's time for other questions, but yeah, one was on how these maps have been used. I think, Ashrita, you talked about the disability map, and that's a great example of how that became a foundation for a disability evidence portal. It informed a systematic review. But any other examples to share on how maps have been used? And I think, Ashwani, you touched on this a little bit. It's about stakeholder engagement, how that is played a part in developing a conceptual framework, which seems all important, for a map, the framework. And so engaging with stakeholders to develop the map, but also to share findings and how it's being used. So any thoughts from all of you on that would be great. Yeah, we have 4 minutes now.
Yeah, so I'll just quickly touch upon your language barrier, the first question that you just mentioned. So, it is definitely a constraint because if you don't have people who understand those languages, you tend to have them as an exclusion criteria. But I think the best way to do it, which we did for violence against children map, is we divided that map into two phases. So in phase one, we tend to include, because of the onus of time, only English language studies. But then we went ahead and expanded that searches to 5 other languages that included French, Arabic, Chinese, and a lot of other languages. What we did was we, and met and hired consultants who are working in those areas and who have experts in the area of systematic synthesis or in the area of research. And they went ahead, did the searches both in Gray literature and the subject specific and language specific databases. And we were able to identify a couple of good studies in that. But I would definitely like to mention a bit of a barrier, because if suppose in your team people do not understand those language, so interpreting those findings that you have got can be a little bit tricky. So it requires a long time for you to sit with the consultants and understand where exactly those data extraction codes have been done. And of course, that is one of the barriers. But I think it is helpful because we were able to identify some really good studies from those other languages, which we would have missed if we did not went ahead with the phase two. So that is one. And in terms of how these evidence and gap maps are used, definitely, I think one example is disability that has been going. I'll take example from a UNICEF initiative funded map as well, where we started with mega map, identified the areas of evidence that were that we did not had good amount of evidence, went ahead with it, and violence against children map. And now we are doing a number of series of consultations in the violence against or end violence groups, presenting the findings of those maps, trying to understand areas where we have issues in terms of evidence and mapping, so that we can go ahead and do systematic reviews. But more importantly, identifying and doing those consultation in the way that why do we have low quality or low confidence studies in those areas. So that is one way of having the entire community sit together, understand not just the key gaps but also the gaps in the form of confidence rating. We have similar examples from homelessness. I think that's the best example of use of evidence. I think they have done really exceptional job. We started with evidence and gap maps. We had 2 maps, one on effectiveness, one on barriers. Went ahead, identified areas where we did not have evidence. The team in UK, they went ahead and did systematic reviews. There were 3 systematic reviews done on those areas, and now an evidence portal is being developed. That would be used in future, of course, for policy making decisions, because it would be catering to that audience that way. So I think we have really good examples, and I'll stop there if my colleagues they have anything else to talk, since we have less time. But yeah, I can keep talking about those stuff. Thank you.
I'm sure. Thank you so much. That's so interesting. Suchi, Ashwani, any last thoughts to add before we close?
Yeah, so I would like to talk about, maybe just for a minute. So it is about the stakeholder consultant process. So what happened, stakeholders they are not only involved in using the map, but they should be involved even in the scoping process and even the piloting process. Because why it is important? They are actually the one who knows the need of this map. So what they have the prior experiences of, what all interventions are important for further process, not only just using the map, but develop a evidence based on this particular map. So it is always good, to have the commissioner kind of thing, or which may be from different fields. They may be from the policymakers, they may be from the researchers, to get involved in scoping the work, in piloting the work as well. Because you never know, even if you define the scope, but while doing the piloting, you might get studies which are not under the scope but which are very important. So developing that particular scope even in the piloting phase is important, and stakeholders or the commissioners from the donor side as well as the researcher side, they play an equal and important role during this particular exercise as well. So that's all my closing note from my side.
Just one minute from, like, in terms of transport, what we actually did is, like, we actually have this like for the phase 1, like the first meet, we actually have this like English language is only included. So that is one of the reasons that we actually have a lot of like English only studies, like which is published in English, because the team we're working, and we have not, because of like we have not extended to the second phase of including more languages. Second thing, in regards to stakeholder consultation, basically for transport, what we actually had, we actually reach out with the finding of our draft finding of our of this map to IIT Delhi, and then we actually reach out to them and say them this is the evidence gaps. But then there were a lot of plans to reach out to some more stakeholders with the finding of this map. But in sports, in one of the review that I was actually working, we actually had an initially, in terms of when we are actually scoping, we already have a stakeholder involved, and we already have a stakeholder meetings with them, and then actually telling them this is the scope of this review, if you really want to add to it and you want to expand to it. And that's what actually happened. We actually only wanted to include sports, just sharing an example, but they said we should also include physical activity if you're actually taking into terms of gender, because girls would be more involved into dance and yoga in terms of the boys. So if you really want to get into, you actually include the physical activity intervention also in as a scope of the review. And then we actually did it, so that it's actually they were still that map review is going on, but they actually involved into, and they actually helped us to define the scoping of it, how to cater to all the public, to all the stakeholders, because they were experienced, they know about this area. And obviously they will be the one who will actually help us and using it, even though it will be in the we are actually working on the drafted report and findings, but then the stakeholder were involved into initial phase of scoping of the review. Thank you from my side.
Thank you so much, and thank you for emphasizing, the aspect of stakeholder engagement, because especially with desk-based work, this is very much needed for it to be relevant to decision makers' needs, as Ashrita has also said that in our chat. So I'm going to say thank you to everyone. Thank you so much. These were very, very interesting presentations of not just innovative work, but important work, going into areas where others are looking at equity, looking at trans. So carry on the good work of Asia, and we'll see everyone at the next session.
Thank you so much, Radhika.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.